Henry Clay Vaughan, known as Hank, was born in the Willamette Valley, on April 27, 1849. He was the first of 7 children born to Alexander and Elizabeth Vaughan, and one of the first babies born in the newly formed Oregon Territory. His grandfather, William Tyler Vaughan, traveled as a cattle drover for Saltether out to Oregon in 1845. Their group went with Stephen Meek on his ill-fated trek south at the Blue Mountains and into the Malheur region of eastern Oregon Territory. There they became lost for 3 weeks, at least 20 of the party perished, and the legend of the Blue Bucket Mine began. Despite this hardship, William, or Captain Billy as he was known, fell in love with the Willamette Valley. He wintered there and returned to Missouri in 1846 with just a couple of horses and tack. Back in Missouri, he made plans for his wife and 9 children to make the trip to Oregon. In 1847, Captain Billy and Phoebe Vaughan moved their brood over the Oregon Trail to near present-day Cobourg, Oregon. That is where his eldest son Alec met and married Elizabeth Fields. The Fields were also recent arrivals to the area. Hank didn't like farming, but he did enjoy being around and tending livestock, especially horses. Hank was 12 when the family moved to the Dalles in 1861. The task of selling the extra horses along with the milk cows was left to Hank. Dealing in livestock would be Hank's main vocation for all of his life. In 1863, Hank went to stay at Canyon City with a couple of his uncles herding cattle. The Vaughan family maintained a herd there to supply area miners with beef. There at a young age Hank started trading and selling horses. At 15, Hank got into a dispute with a miner over partial payment on a horse. When the miner stated that it was a stolen horse anyway, Hank drew his pistol and fired. His shot glanced off the miner's forehead but didn't kill him. Hank was arrested and released on bail. After getting out, Hank started drinking and threatened to shoot the miner or the witness who had pressed charges against him. When the witness showed up, Hank shot and wounded him. Hank was rearrested and sent to the Dalles to await trial. After 4 months in jail, Hank's cases went to trial. The case, regarding the wounding of the miner, was dismissed, but the case about shooting the witness proceeded. When the jury couldn't agree on a verdict, Hank's father, Alec, made a plea to the judge that resulted in Hank's release. Later that same day, Hank, Alec, and 2 of the Vaughan cousins joined the 1st Oregon Volunteer Infantry at the Dalles. Hank's family hoped that would straighten him out. That wasn't to be. Hank disliked being forced into the service and made the fact well known. Within 6 weeks Hank was mustered out of the Guard as unfit for service. After being discharged, Hank stayed around the Dalles until April. During that time, he joined up with another youth, Dick Bunton. The two made plans to gather several horses to take to the Idaho Territory. They could get upwards of $200 per mount from the miners in Idaho, and Bunton knew the trails. The profit from one pony alone was more than Hank would make in a year herding cattle with his uncles. Though young, Hank was more than willing to take the risks. The pair worked their way up the Columbia River and set up camp outside of Pendleton. They camped there about a month trading with the Indians. When Hank and Dick left to cross the Blue Mountains, they stole a couple of horses from a ranch nearby. One night the two were camped near the Burnt River when Sheriff Frank Maddock and Deputy Jackson Hart caught up with them. The sheriff and deputy crept up on the youths in the moonlight and surprised them in their bedrolls. When told to throw up their hands, young Hank and Dick came up firing 6-shooters. Bunton and Hart were killed in the gunfire. Sheriff Maddock had a severe wound to his head. Hank was bleeding from a wound to his thigh and a crease in his scalp. Maddock couldn't move and Hank briefly escaped but was captured shortly thereafter. His second time in court wouldn't go so well for Hank. In 1865, at the age of 16, Hank Vaughan was sentenced to life in prison. When he entered the penal system, the prison was in Portland, but in 1866 the inmates were marched south to Salem. There the prisoners were to build the new state penitentiary where they would be housed. Escapes from the old prison were frequent, and the Oregon Boot was devised to thwart these attempts. Hank was most certainly familiar with this device. While in prison, Hank received a more formal education in reading and writing while also gaining a criminal education from hardened convicts. While Hank was in prison, the Vaughan family rallied to his aid and petitioned the governor for Hank's release. Their reasoning was that Hank thought he was being robbed the night he shot and killed Deputy Hart. On February 22, 1870, Hank received a full pardon from Governor George S. Woods. That would be the only time Hank would spend in prison. He would be jailed again, but not for any length of time. Upon his release from prison, Hank was not quite 21 and had already been involved in 3 shootings. He had served over 4.5 years in prison, not counting jail time awaiting trials. While he was in prison, his family had moved back to the Willamette Valley, and upon his release, He went there and used that time to help the family ready a herd of cattle for market. Hank then accompanied his father, uncles, and cousins on a cattle drive that ended at the newly established railroad depot at Elko, Nevada. With all of his past troubles in Oregon, Hank decided to try his luck in the Elko area. In 1875, Hank acquired and stocked a ranch on the Humboldt River east of Elko. The ranch was ideally situated close to the borders of the Idaho and Utah territories. That was a characteristic that all of Hank's future operations would share, since it was advantageous to be within a 1 or 2 hour hard ride from a border when handling stock with questionable ownership. Hank also learned that it was best to have a legitimate business and become known in the community to cover shady dealings. He also acquired a wife at about the same time, marrying 19-year-old Lois J. McCarty. Her brothers were the notorious McCarty brothers, Tom, Bill, and George. Butch Cassidy rode with Tom prior to Butch's days with the Wild Bunch. In short order, Hank fathered 2 sons, though he was never much of a father to the boys. He apparently wasn't much of a husband either, because in late 1877, Lois left Hank and took the boys with her. In 1878, Hank returned to Oregon. He chose the Pendleton region as his base of operations. Soon after arriving there, Hank Vaughan married Louisa Jane Diddy. Of course, Hank hadn't bothered divorcing Lois before marrying Louisa. Hank established a home with Louisa in a cabin on Wild Horse Creek. As with his first wife, Hank rarely spent time with Louisa. The new union would run the same course as before, lasting until 1881. That is when Louisa, tired of being alone, left Hank. During his time in the Pendleton area, Hank made a legendary ride. The town of Pilot Rock got its name from the bluff above the town. The butte slopes up from the back and has a near vertical face with naturally occurring terraces at varying elevations. Hank was in a Pilot Rock saloon when he was braced by 4 local ranchers about stolen stock. He got the drop on them and made his escape. A posse followed him out of town and up onto the top of Pilot Rock. With the posse closing on him, Hank put spurs to his bay and rode over the edge of Pilot Rock. None of the posse was willing to take the risk. Hank rode his horse into the bar he just left, had another drink, and was gone before the posse returned. Hank was known to have a keen eye for horseflesh and to keep the finest for his own use. It was agreed by all who knew Hank that he was an exceptional horseman. That wasn't a meaningless compliment back when everyone rode horseback. While in eastern Oregon, Hank expanded his operations into the territories of Idaho and Washington. His father and other Vaughan relatives were living outside of Boise City, and Hank also had Vaughan uncles and cousins in Goldendale, Yakima, and Ellensburg. At his new operation, Hank put up corrals and a cabin near Spokane Falls. Since it was easier to move horses and cattle from Washington into Montana Territory than from Oregon. With these new improvements, Hank was able to move livestock all the way from Elko, Nevada through Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, and eventually Montana. No evidence ever surfaced linking Hank's father, or any of the Vaughan uncles, to Hank's illegal activities. The same can't be said of some of his cousins. Hank's legitimate businesses afforded him cover and also gave Hank the appearance of respectability. On one trip to Boise City in 1879, he was involved in a gunfight with Pitt Smith. Pitt challenged Hank in the street, drew first and missed. Hank's slug struck Smith in the hip but wasn't fatal. As Pitt Smith had drawn first, charges against Hank were dismissed. Hank's reputation grew. In December of 1881, Hank entered Prineville, Oregon. The day after arriving, he was making his way through the bars when he ran into Charlie Long, a local cowboy, at Dick Graham's place. The two had a card game that ended after a hand that Long won. Hank left Graham's bar but later met up with Charlie again in Till Glaze's Singer Saloon. Hank offered to buy a drink and Charlie declined. Hank took off his bandana with his left hand and offered the other end to Charlie for a Missouri Jewel. The rest of the patrons quickly departed the bar as Long grabbed the other end of the neckerchief. Hank pulled his revolver first but let Charlie take the opening shot. That shot put a furrow through the center of Hank's scalp. The two took turns exchanging shots while still clasping the kerchief. Hank whooped, hollered and jumped around while Long was basically a stationary target. At the end of the gunplay, Long had his 6-shooter pressed against Hank's head when the cylinder landed on a defective round. The combatants were both bleeding profusely. Charlie Long caught 4 slugs, 1 over the heart, 1 in the belly and 1 each in an arm and hand. Hank only received 2 other wounds besides the almost fatal crease to his forehead. Both of those wounds were close to his heart. Each man would survive his injuries and they would meet again years later. The gunfight was reported in most of the newspapers in the Pacific Northwest. Some even erroneously declared that the outlaw Hank Vaughan had met his match and succumbed. Hank would later visit and intimidate the editors who chose to print word of his early demise. By the winter of 1881 to 1882, Hank had taken up with the widow Martha Craig Robe. Her father was William Craig, the mountain man and acknowledged first white settler in the Idaho Territory. Her mother, Isabel, was Nez Perce, the daughter of Chief James. Martha's late husband A. H. Roby sold his diamond ranch to Peter French before Roby's death in 1878. She had a ranch on the Boise River near the small town of Star, Idaho Territory, not far from the home of Hank's parents. Hank and Martha would get a ranch together on the lower end of Wild Horse Creek. With Martha being part Nez Perce, they additionally claimed land in her name on the nearby Umatilla Indian Reservation. The use of Indian land in his horse-rustling operation would vex authorities for years. Centerville, Oregon, now Athena, was the closest town to these properties. Martha entered the relationship with money, which added to Hank's illusion of integrity. In 1888, Martha would legally become Mrs. Hank Vaughan. The two would travel extensively and be together for the rest of Hank's life. Most people would describe Hank as a smaller man with a neat appearance who was reasonable, courteous and fearless, unless he was drinking. He was known to be a practical joker and an excellent storyteller. Then again, he grew up listening to the tales of Captain Billy's adventures. When drinking, he went from being fearless to outright reckless. Pendleton was said to be littered with wrecked buggies from Hank's alcohol-fueled escapades. He was easily bored when imbibing and liked to make tenderfeet dance. On August 8, 1886, Hank was drinking in a Centerville saloon. He chose a southern newcomer for the butt of his next joke. That man's name was Bill Falwell, and he took great offense when Hank made him dance with bullets flying. Falwell traded his horse for a .50 caliber pistol and went looking for Hank. He found him the next day, August 9, inside Donica's store. Hank was talking to Dick Donica when Falwell burst in threatening to kill Vaughan. He started shooting as soon as he saw Hank. His first shot broke Hank's right arm. Hank ducked behind a spool case as he was unarmed. The spool case took the rest of the lead from Bill's revolver. When the gun clicked on an empty chamber, Hank came out from behind the case and started pummeling his assailant. That's when the sheriff showed up and broke up the fight. The broken right arm was quite serious to Hank, for it was his gun arm. Like his previous injuries, Hank would recover and was still able to handle his pistol with proficiency. However, while recouping from this injury, Hank learned to shoot left-handed. From that time on, Hank wore two handguns. As Hank aged, he gained stability along with public acceptance. That was probably due to Martha. Martha's land holdings were extensive and Hank took this responsibility seriously. The wheat farming operation on the Umatilla Reservation Ranch was quite successful because of Hank's management. It was considered a prime example of dry land farming. Of course, everything wasn't exactly as it seemed. Much of the capital that went into the ranch was borrowed. Like always, creditors had a difficult time collecting on their loans. Hank rode one of his horses to Pendleton and had it shot on May 30, 1893. That trip would include some stops at the saloons. When Hank left for home, he decided to treat the town to one of his riding exhibitions. He was racing pell-mell down Main Street when his sorrel stumbled and fell with him. His mount got up, but Hank just lay there unconscious. They took him to the transfer house and sent for the doctor. When Hank came to his senses, his chest was hurting and he had an obscenely swollen eye. At first it seemed like he might once again recover from another grave injury. However, a few days later his condition turned for the worse. Hank was in a semi-comatose state and slipping. He held on for a couple of weeks. There were daily updates on his condition in the newspapers of the Pacific Northwest. Charlie Long was one of the many who paid his respects to Hank while he lay in his room at the transfer house. On June 15, 1893, the outlaw Hank Vaughan passed away at the age of 44 from his head injuries. In conversations with Marshal John Bentley late in his life, Hank admitted to killing 13 men in his lifetime. Incidentally, that is the same number of bullet scars Hank's body bore at the time of his death. Only 6 of those scars are accounted for from Hank's documented wounds. Hank was able to live wild and untamed because of the bustling area he lived in. Horses and beef were in huge demand for settlers, miners, and of course, railroad construction crews. Hank Vaughan was considered the ringleader of a large band of horse thieves encompassing the entire Pacific Northwest. He was believed to be involved with many other crimes, including the bank robbery in Roslyn, Washington Territory. Hank Vaughan was larger than life and one of the more colorful characters of the Wild West. Yet, he is largely unknown to history buffs today. The little bits of information found in books or articles published before 1997 seem to be based on erroneous data from a man named William Parsons. In 1902, Parsons co-authored The History of Umatilla and Morrow County. He must have acquired most of his information from word of mouth, not public records, for much of it is inaccurate or incomplete. Parsons was a lawyer who crossed paths with Hank. According to Parsons, Hank persuaded him to accept a gift that Parsons did not want. Later, they had a dispute over fees concerning Hank's divorce from his first wife Lois. Parsons claims that Hank treated him with great dignity from that time on. Still, it appears that Parsons' insight isn't entirely objective. It does show that just as many people had strong negative feelings towards Hank as liked him. When another historian, John Scovlin, started combing through newspaper articles, government records and interviewing relatives in 1965. He was apparently the first to do so and use the information. Scovlin and his wife Donna spent 30 years researching the life of Hank Vaughan for their definitive biography on him. It's amazing that in today's era of movie retreads, nobody has discovered this legitimate, one-of-a-kind, true character of the Wild West.